Imagine a Roman hero, captured by his enemies, sent back to Rome with an impossible choice, only to return to a death so agonizing it shocked the ancient world. Was this a tale of ultimate sacrifice or unimaginable cruelty? In the relentless crucible of the First Punic War, where the nascent might of Rome clashed with the entrenched power of Carthage across the vast expanse of the Mediterranean, individual destinies often became mere footnotes in the epic struggle for supremacy. Yet within these blood-drenched annals of ancient conflict, there emerges a narrative so stark in its depiction of honor, sacrifice, and unimaginable suffering that it continues to echo through the millennia, a chilling testament to the brutal tenets of a bygone age. This is the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a man whose steadfast adherence to an oath would seal his fate in a manner so grotesque it transformed him from a general into a legend, etched forever in the collective memory of a republic that valued principle above life itself. The year 255 BC found the Roman war machine in the unfamiliar landscape of North Africa, having dared to carry the war to Carthage's very gates. Regulus, a consul of Rome, had led a formidable expeditionary force, boasting a fleet of 300 ships and an army of 15,000 men, across the perilous waters to the enemy's heartland. Initial victories had been swift and decisive, painting a canvas of overwhelming Roman dominance. The Carthaginian countryside lay ravaged, its towns plundered, and 20,000 captives groaned beneath the yoke of Roman chains, testament to Regulus's martial prowess. The general, flushed with success and imbued with the unyielding confidence that often accompanies early triumphs, had driven the enemy to the brink, cornering them within their very capital, a strategic masterpiece that seemed destined to conclude the war on Rome's terms. Yet, as is often the cruel twist of fate in the grand tapestry of warfare, victory's intoxicating aroma can blind even the most seasoned commander to the lurking shadows of unforeseen reversals. The beleaguered Carthaginians, teetering on the precipice of utter ruin, made a desperate plea for terms, only to be met by Regulus's uncompromising and, some would argue, arrogant demands. He dictated peace with the imperious authority of an already triumphant victor, terms so harsh that they amounted to absolute surrender, leaving the desperate Carthaginians with no recourse but to fight or perish in ignominy. It was into this crucible of desperation that a new, formidable figure strode. Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary, a man whose tactical genius and disciplined approach stood in stark contrast to the often impetuous Roman methods. Under his tutelage, the Carthaginian forces, reinvigorated and strategically reorganized, moved with a newfound cohesion. The battlefield where these two colossal wills collided lay near the Bagradas River, a landscape that would soon bear witness to a cataclysmic reversal of fortunes. Xanthippus, wielding his formidable phalanx formations and utilizing the terrifying charge of his war elephants, utterly annihilated Regulus's legions. The Roman infantry, accustomed to open field maneuvering, found themselves crushed beneath the weight of Carthaginian heavy cavalry and impaled upon the bristling spears of the Spartan-trained phalangites. The disciplined ranks of Rome shattered, their formations dissolved into a chaotic rout. Of the 15,000 Roman legionaries, a mere 2,000 managed to escape the slaughter. The rest, along with their once victorious consul, were either cut down in the bloody mire or captured, dragged off to face the grim future that awaited prisoners of war in an era unacquainted with mercy. Regulus, the triumphant commander who had once stood poised to dictate the very terms of peace, now found himself a captive, stripped of his authority, his dignity, and his freedom. A stark illustration of the capricious nature of military glory. For 5 agonizing years, Regulus languished in the dark confines of a Carthaginian prison, his once vaunted status now reduced to that of a humbled hostage. The war, despite Rome's setback in Africa, continued its grinding, relentless course, punctuated by intermittent Carthaginian defeats and the rising toll of attrition on both sides. As the conflict stretched on, with no clear end in sight, the Carthaginians, worn down by the protracted struggle and burdened by a dwindling number of their own prominent captives, sought a diplomatic gambit. They proposed a prisoner exchange and, more ambitiously, a path toward peace. To add weight to their proposal, and perhaps to exploit the legendary Roman adherence to honor, they devised a bold strategy. They would send Regulus himself back to Rome to present their terms. But this was no act of magnanimity, for it was inextricably bound by a sacred and terrible compact. Before his release, Regulus was forced to swear an oath, a solemn vow made before the Carthaginian gods and witnessed by their sternest magistrates. He pledged that if he failed to secure either a general peace treaty or the exchange of Carthaginian prisoners for Roman ones, he would, without hesitation or demur, return to Carthage. This was not merely a promise, but an irrevocable bond, forged in the crucible of his captivity, a testament to the belief that even in the darkest dungeons, a Roman's word was his unbreakable law. The Carthaginians, understanding the gravity with which Romans regarded such oaths, believed they held an ironclad guarantee of his return, or at least a powerful lever for their diplomatic efforts. They failed to grasp the full, horrifying implications of such an oath when placed in the heart of a Roman. Thus, Marcus Atilius Regulus, the once vanquished general, now bore not chains, but a burden of honor far heavier, as he set sail for Rome, a ghost from the past, entrusted with the future, oblivious to the horrific fate that awaited him upon his inevitable return. The battered trireme, a relic of Rome's dominion over the waves, a vessel that had once borne legions to conquest, now cut a solitary, almost mournful furrow through the cerulean expanse of the Mediterranean. It carried not a triumphant consul laden with spoils, nor a conquering hero returning to garlands and acclamations, but a gaunt, broken man, shrouded in the phantom chains of a terrible oath. 5 agonizing years had etched themselves onto the once proud, commanding lines of Marcus Atilius Regulus's face, twisting its features into a mask of stoic suffering, a living testament to the relentless privations of a Carthaginian dungeon. Yet, within the depths of his eyes, despite the weariness and the palpable weight of his ordeal, there burned an unyielding flame of Roman gravitas, a light that spoke of an unshakable purpose, a resolve forged in the crucible of despair. His return to the Eternal City was not merely the homecoming of a long-lost general, a figure resurrected from the assumed oblivion of North African sands. It was the chilling arrival of a living ghost, a stark, visceral reminder of the war's brutal, insatiable toll and the unyielding, almost terrifying moral codes that governed the Roman soul, demanding adherence even unto death. As the news of his improbable, almost miraculous return spread like wildfire through the ancient, sun-baked streets of Rome, a palpable wave of astonishment, quickly followed by fervent anticipation, swept through the populace. Whispers turned to exclamations, skepticism to breathless wonder. Rome had mourned him, had performed the solemn rites for a man assumed, swallowed whole by the unforgiving desert and the merciless Carthaginian blade. His name had been spoken with a reverence reserved for those who had paid the ultimate price for the Republic. Yet here he was, inexplicably delivered back to their gates, not by the might of Roman arms, but by the very hands of his captors. A living paradox that defied all logical explanation, save for the potent, almost mystical power of an oath. The common citizens, from the plebeian throngs in the Forum to the aristocratic families on the Palatine, found themselves caught between elation at his survival and a creeping dread concerning the unspoken terms of his freedom. What impossible burden did this resurrected hero carry? What terrible price had been exacted for his momentary reprieve? The Senate, that venerable assembly of patriarchs who, with their collective wisdom and formidable will, guided Rome's destiny, convened with an urgency rarely witnessed outside of immediate invasion or existential threat. The senators, their faces a tableau of conflicting emotions, profound curiosity, unfeigned admiration for the man who stood as a living legend, and a deep-seated sense of duty to the Republic, understood the gravity of the situation with an almost instinctual certainty. They knew, without needing to be told, that the terms Regulus carried were not those of a suppliant seeking succor, but those of an emissary bound by the most sacred and terrifying of vows. The air within the hallowed confines of the Curia Hostilia, usually thick with the impassioned rhetoric of political maneuvering, the clash of ideologies, and the relentless hum of ambition, now thrummed with an almost reverential silence, a hushed expectation broken only by the whispers of history unfolding, preparing to take another pivotal, tragic turn. Every eye in that august chamber was fixed upon the figure who dared to walk through its doors, a man whose presence alone seemed to distill the very essence of Roman identity. Regulus, ever conscious of the profound symbolism of his actions, had, upon his capture, relinquished his consular rank, refusing to allow his misfortune, however unavoidable, to stain Rome's highest office. He entered the Senate chamber, not in the purple-bordered toga of a magistrate, but in the plain, unadorned white toga of a private citizen, a deliberate choice that underscored his humility and underscored his position as a servant of the state, not its master. He stood before them not as a man seeking solace or release from his torment, nor as one begging for his life, but as a stark, almost unyielding vessel of Carthaginian will. With a voice that, though weathered by 5 years of privation and the relentless gnawing of despair, resonated with an unwavering clarity, he presented their proposals. He dutifully outlined Carthage's grievances, their desires for respite, their desperate plea for an end to the ceaseless bloodshed that was draining their resources and their manpower. He laid before them the Carthaginian overtures, a cessation of hostilities, a general peace to finally end the agonizing, seemingly interminable conflict, and, crucially, a comprehensive exchange of prisoners, Roman captives for Carthaginian ones. The Senate listened intently, their faces a complex tableau of conflicting emotions, a flicker of hope for peace, indignation at what they perceived as Carthaginian arrogance in daring to dictate terms, and a profound, almost paternal sympathy for the gaunt man who stood before them, a hero brought low by the fortunes of war. Then, having fulfilled his sacred obligation to his captors with meticulous precision, having delivered their message without embellishment or omission, Marcus Atilius Regulus performed the act that would forever sear his name into the very firmament of Roman memory. He stepped forward, a subtle but profound shift in his bearing, no longer merely the Carthaginian envoy, but Marcus Atilius Regulus, a son of Rome, a man whose heart beat solely and irrevocably for the Republic. He cleared his throat, a small, almost imperceptible sound in the hushed chamber. Yet it seemed to echo with the weight of centuries. The very air in the Curia Hostilia seemed to hold its breath, every senator leaning forward, anticipating the words that would follow. With a gravity that chilled the very bones of those present, a solemnity that acknowledged the immense, tragic import of his counsel, he delivered his advice. He urged the Senate, with every fiber of his being, to reject the Carthaginian overtures, to refuse both the offer of a general peace and the proposed exchange of prisoners. The words hung heavy in the air, a stark, almost unbelievable pronouncement from a man whose immediate freedom, whose very life, depended entirely upon the acceptance of those same terms. It was an act of profound, almost suicidal, selflessness. His reasoning, delivered with a chilling lucidity that cut through the emotional haze of his personal suffering, was a masterclass in Roman pragmatism and unbending honor. First, he dissected the Carthaginian proposal for peace, exposing it not as a genuine desire for harmony, but as a cunning, desperate ploy. He argued that Carthage, reeling from repeated Roman victories at sea and the crippling attrition of 5 long years of war, was on the brink of collapse. Their treasury was depleted, their manpower dwindling, their morale shattered. To accept peace now, he warned, would be to squander Rome's hard-won strategic advantage, to throw away the countless sacrifices already made in blood and treasure. It would be to grant their enemy a vital reprieve, allowing them to rebuild their fleets, replenish their armies, and regroup their forces, only to reignite the conflict at a later, more advantageous moment for Carthage. Such a move, he argued with unwavering conviction, would be a catastrophic strategic blunder, an act of unforgivable short-sightedness that would ultimately cost Rome far more in the long run. Then, with an even more brutal and unvarnished honesty, he turned to the proposed prisoner exchange. He painted a grim, unsparing picture, devoid of sentimentality, a cold calculation that prioritized the Republic's strength above individual lives, even his own. The Roman captives in Carthage, he explained, were, like himself, broken men. 5 years of harsh imprisonment, of meager rations, of disease and despair, had left them too old, too sick, too weakened to ever again bear arms effectively for the Republic. Their bodies were scarred, their spirits perhaps irrevocably broken. Their Carthaginian counterparts, however, were, by and large, young, robust, and militarily valuable soldiers, men whose physical prowess remained intact, whose release would only serve to invigorate the enemy's depleted ranks and provide them with fresh, battle-ready warriors. "Do not exchange," he declared, his voice ringing with an almost savage conviction that tolerated no dissent. "A handful of useless old men, decrepit and broken, for a host of vigorous, battle-ready foes, men who will immediately turn their strength against our legions." It was a ruthless calculus, but one entirely in keeping with the severe, unromanticized logic of Roman warfare. But beneath these calculated arguments of strategic advantage, beneath this cold assessment of military utility, lay a deeper, more profound justification, a testament to the ironclad, unbreakable grip of his oath. He looked upon the faces of his former colleagues, his family, his friends, his gaze sweeping across the faces etched with admiration, pity, and growing awe, and stated unequivocally that he was a man dishonored by his capture, a consul who, despite the vagaries of fortune, had failed in his primary duty to his legions and to the Republic. To redeem such a man, To save his life at the expense of Rome's vital strategic interests would be an act of profound weakness, an erosion of the very principles that had forged Rome into a burgeoning empire. He stood before them, not as a man pleading for his life, but as a sentinel guarding the very soul of the Republic, its moral integrity, its unyielding commitment to fides. To accept the Carthaginian terms, he argued, would be to set a dangerous precedent, implying that Rome valued the life of a single, albeit esteemed, general, more than the collective well-being, the military integrity, and the sacred honor of the entire state. His fides, his sworn word to the Carthaginian gods, demanded his return. His pietas, his duty to Rome, demanded his counsel. And for Regulus, piety always superseded personal interest. The Senate, gripped by the sheer moral force of his arguments and the terrifying clarity of his self-condemnation, was plunged into a maelstrom of moral agony. Here was their hero, their venerated general, not only urging his own condemnation, but doing so with an unshakable conviction that bespoke the highest ideals of Roman sacrifice. The dilemma was agonizing, almost unbearable. To deny him, to refuse his counsel, would be to condemn Rome to a strategically inferior position, a moral betrayal of the state. To accept his counsel, however, was to send him to an almost certain and likely horrific death, a profound personal betrayal of a man who had exemplified Roman virtue. The debate raged for days within the Curia Hostilia, an unprecedented outpouring of argument and counter-argument. Some senators, tears in their eyes, appealed to compassion, to the debt Rome owed this hero, arguing that no strategic advantage was worth the life of such a man. Others, perhaps with a colder, more pragmatic eye, recognized the unassailable logic of Regulus's strategic arguments, even as their hearts recoiled from the implications. Amidst this fervent, heart-wrenching debate, his family, particularly his devoted wife, Marcia, and his sons, emerged from the shadows of private grief to make public, desperate pleas. Their entreaties, laced with tears and the raw anguish of imminent loss, echoed through the grand halls, begging him to reconsider, to allow Rome to save him, to accept his release. They spoke of the deep love they held for him, of the solace he would find in his home, of the future they could yet share. They implored him to consider his own life, their profound sorrow, the void his absence would leave. But Regulus, like a rock against the raging tide, remained steadfast, an immovable bulwark against the emotional onslaught. His oath, his fides, was an unbreachable covenant, a sacred bond forged not merely with men, but with the divine. He had given his word, and a Roman's word, especially one sworn to the gods, was eternal, immutable, more precious than any mortal life, including his own. He would not, could not, violate it. For in doing so, he would not only damn his own soul, but compromise the very moral integrity of the Republic he so fiercely loved. He understood the dreadful, almost unimaginable consequences of his counsel, perhaps more clearly than anyone else in that hallowed chamber, for he had witnessed firsthand the Carthaginian temperament, their capacity for vengeance, their disregard for what Romans considered civilized conduct. He knew the depths of their fury, the lengths to which they would go to exact retribution. Yet, the honor of Rome, the integrity of his oath, the unblemished sanctity of his word, outweighed even the most terrifying specters of personal torment and suffering. With a final resolute gaze that encompassed the entire Senate, a gaze that conveyed both a profound, personal sorrow and an unwavering, almost terrifying resolve. He reiterated his counsel, cementing his choice, sealing his fate. The Senate, recognizing the sheer moral force of the man before them, and swayed by his unassailable arguments for Rome's strategic future, made their agonizing decision, one that would forever be etched into the collective memory of the Republic. They would follow Regulus's advice. They would refuse the Carthaginian terms, and Marcus Atilius Regulus, having condemned himself for the sake of his beloved Republic, turned his back on the safety of Rome and the anguished pleas of his family, and, without a single complaint, without a backward glance, prepared to return to his captors, to an unknown, yet undoubtedly horrific, fate. The path to his execution was now irrevocably set, paved not by Carthaginian malice alone, but by the very Roman virtues he embodied and championed, virtues that demanded the ultimate sacrifice. With a spirit miraculously unbent, a will forged in the fires of Roman principle, though his body now bore the indelible, visible scars of long privation, and a stride that, despite 5 grueling years of dungeon confinement, remained stubbornly, defiantly, unwavering. Marcus Atilius Regulus returned to the sun-drenched, dust-choked shores of Carthage. He was not merely a prisoner exchanged, but a man who had freely and deliberately chosen an agonizing, prolonged death over the indelible, corroding stain of dishonor. It was a choice so profound, so utterly counterintuitive to the primal scream of self-preservation, that it reverberated through the very bedrock of ancient morality, shaking the foundations of Carthaginian understanding. His arrival was no quiet, understated return of a humbled captive, his head bowed in supplication. Instead, it was a stark, undeniable, and deeply infuriating proof of Roman fides, that unyielding, almost mystical adherence to a sworn word, a sacred covenant that transcended, and indeed brazenly defied, every basic instinct for survival. It was a demonstration of a moral fortitude, an internal resolve that the pragmatic Carthaginians, steeped as they were in the brutal realities of power politics and military might, simply could not comprehend, let alone tolerate. The scene on the docks, as the Roman vessel nudged the Carthaginian pier, was initially one of stunned, disbelieving silence. The Punic guards and officials, having seen him depart, could not fathom his return. This was not the broken, desperate man they had expected to manipulate. Their initial astonishment, once fleeting and born of sheer disbelief, quickly gave way to a chilling, furious metamorphosis. Their faces, at first slack with surprise, tightened into masks of bitter, vengeful rage. Regulus, after all, had not merely failed to deliver their desired peace, a diplomatic triumph that would have secured their position, granted them invaluable respite, and perhaps even turned the tide of the protracted bloody war. No, he had, with audacious and unforgivable clarity, actively conspired against their most vital interests within the very sacred halls of the Roman Senate. He had, with his own measured words, sealed his own doom, yet in doing so, had, in the most profound and ironic sense, saved Rome from a disadvantageous peace and a fatally weakened military. Their initial desperate hope for a cunning diplomatic triumph, a gambit meticulously designed to exploit Roman honor, had been shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments, replaced now by the profound, burning humiliation of a meticulously crafted plan, brutally foiled by the indomitable will of one lone man. This man, this Roman, had dared to expose their weakness, to turn their own weapon of honor against them, to mock their expectations, and for that unforgivable transgression, he would pay a price that defied all human comprehension, a debt to be collected in flesh and spirit. The fury that greeted Regulus upon his voluntary return transcended mere political frustration. It was a deeply personal affront, a visceral reaction that vibrated through every Carthaginian heart, a seething indignation at a Roman daring to place an abstract concept like honor, a mere vow sworn to foreign gods, above a life that was, by all ancient standards of warfare, already forfeit. The Carthaginian leadership, accustomed to the ruthless, pragmatic calculus of power and conquest, to betrayals and expedient alliances, found themselves utterly bewildered by a man who, with a serene and terrifying resolve, willingly walked back into the maw of certain unspeakable torment, purely for the sake of an oath. This bewildering defiance, this unyielding Roman spirit that refused to be cowed or broken, ignited a blaze of savage retribution, a firestorm of vengeful cruelty that sought not merely to kill, but to utterly obliterate, to erase the very essence of the man who had dared to humble them. Regulus, once a prisoner of war and then a temporary envoy, was now transformed into an object lesson in the terrible, agonizing consequences of daring to cross Carthage, of exposing its strategic vulnerabilities. His fate was to become a living canvas upon which the most sadistic impulses of his captors would be painted in excruciating detail, a tormented, breathing sacrifice to their wounded pride and insatiable desire for absolute, crushing vengeance. The details of his execution, whispered in hushed, horrified tones across the ancient world, and painstakingly recorded, though perhaps embellished, by Roman historians, are not merely gruesome, but were meticulously designed to inflict the maximum possible suffering, to break not just the body, but the very spirit, transforming a man forged in Roman iron into a shattered, despairing vessel, a cautionary tale carved in living flesh. The long, agonizing ordeal began not with a swift, decisive blow, the merciful stroke of a sword or the quick choking embrace of a noose, but with a calculated, insidious dismantling of his senses, his faculties, and ultimately, his very humanity. His tormentors, perhaps advised by cruel specialists in pain, understood that to truly break a man of Regulus's caliber, a man whose mind was as formidable as his physical prowess, one must first attack the citadel of his intellect, his very sanity. Thus, they subjected him to a relentless regime of chronic sleep deprivation, a torment designed to erode the very fabric of his mental resilience, blurring the lines between waking agony and nightmarish slumber, forcing him into ceaseless vigil, his eyes propped open, his body constantly jostled or prodded to prevent even a moment's unconsciousness. Day and night merged into an endless hallucination-laced torment. His body screamed for the rest that was cruelly denied, each nerve ending singing with unbearable fatigue. His thoughts, once so clear and resolute, fragmented into a dizzying chaos, his perceptions warped by the lack of restorative sleep. Yet, his Roman fortitude, that unyielding core of his being, refused to buckle, even as his mind threatened to unravel, clinging desperately to fragments of reality. Each hour bled into the next, an eternity of exhausted wakefulness, a slow mental strangulation, as his captors watched, patiently, for the final, irreversible collapse of his spirit. The goal was not merely pain, but the systematic erasure of his identity, the transformation of a proud consul into a gibbering wreck. Next came the unspeakable assault upon his sight, a cruel and agonizing irony for a man who had seen too much of war's horrors, who had gazed across battlefields to command the movements of legions, who had once surveyed the vast Mediterranean as a conquering admiral. His eyelids, those delicate protective curtains of vision, were systematically cut away, crudely excised with whatever implements of cruelty lay at hand. Perhaps a rusty blade or a searing hot iron. The agonizing tearing of flesh, the immediate flood of scalding tears and hot blood left his eyes unblinkingly, excruciatingly exposed to the relentless, unforgiving glare of the North African sun. There was no shade, no respite, no moment for the delicate orb to seek darkness. Day after merciless day, under that scorching, pitiless sky, he was forced to stare directly into its blinding, white-hot intensity. His vision, initially blurred by the agony and the constant flow of bodily fluids, soon burned with an unbearable ferocity, then tore as the delicate tissues of his eyes began to cook and blister under the constant, unremitting assault, until the world he once knew dissolved into a searing, agonizing white haze that offered no forms, only pain. The delicate membranes of his eyes inflamed, festered with infection, and wept pus and blood, mingling with the dust and sweat that coated his face, running down his cheeks in grotesque rivulets. Each involuntary blink, each spasm of his ravaged eyelids brought a fresh wave of agony, each moment an unbearable assault on the very organs through which he had once surveyed battlefields, commanded legions, and contemplated the fate of empires. The deliberate, prolonged destruction of his sight was not merely torture. It was a profound, symbolic obliteration of his power to perceive, to judge, to command, to even retain a shred of the world he once knew. His vision, his capacity to navigate and lead, was systematically extinguished, leaving him adrift in a perpetual, agonizing darkness, or a searing, blinding light, utterly dependent and vulnerable. But the Carthaginians, their thirst for vengeance still unquenched, their pride still smarting, were unsatisfied with this static, internal torment. They needed to externalize his suffering, to make it a dynamic, horrifying spectacle. They added a new, diabolical element to his ordeal, transforming his spiked prison into a rolling engine of unimaginable pain. The barrel, with Regulus trapped inside, his body already a canvas of fresh and festering wounds, was then heaved to the top of a steep, rocky hill. The harsh sounds of the men straining, the scraping of the crude wood against the earth, must have been a terrifying prelude to the next phase of his torment. With a perverse delight, almost a macabre ceremony, it was then sent careening downwards, bouncing and crashing violently over the uneven, unforgiving terrain. Each violent lurch, each sickening impact against the ground, each jarring collision with stones and roots sent the spikes deeper, much deeper, into his already ravaged body, amplifying his wounds, splintering bones, tearing at his internal organs with a ferocity that defied description. The excruciating agony of being rolled, repeatedly, down a rough slope in this diabolical contraption must have been incomprehensible, a nightmare of bone-shattering impacts, flesh-rending perforations, and the dizzying nausea of uncontrolled motion compounded by extreme trauma and blood loss. His body, already a testament to prolonged suffering, became a pulpy, mangled mass of tissue, bleeding profusely from countless new and reopened wounds. Yet his life, fueled by some incomprehensible, almost superhuman will, clung on with a terrifying tenacity, refusing to surrender to the sweet oblivion of death, refusing to give his tormentors the satisfaction of a broken spirit. Finally, having endured weeks, perhaps even agonizing months, of this unfathomable sequence of tortures, the relentless sleeplessness that warped his mind, the blinding sun that had burned out his vision, the spiked confinement that had torn his flesh, and the brutal tumbles that had shattered his bones, Regulus was exposed to the pitiless North African elements, left to face the final, slow embrace of nature's indifference. His body, a ruined vessel, was no longer confined, but simply left out, stripped bare, to the mercy of the climate. The sun, which had already scorched his eyes into uselessness, now baked his open, festering wounds, drying the blood, cracking the skin, and attracting legions of flies and biting insects that swarmed his decaying flesh, feeding upon him while he still breathed, a horrifying living feast. The days were an inferno, a parching heat that stole the last vestiges of moisture from his ravaged body. The nights brought chilling winds and creeping dampness, exacerbating his infections, chilling him to the bone, denying him even the comfort of temperature regulation, pushing him ever closer to hypothermia. He endured the gnawing agony of starvation and thirst, his mind drifting into delirium as his body slowly shut down, cell by agonizing cell. To further degrade him, to hasten his demise through sheer, overwhelming terror, and perhaps as a final, macabre jest that spoke volumes of Carthaginian contempt, his tormentors unleashed a wild, untamed elephant, leaving it to trumpet and stomp terrifyingly close to his enfeebled, helpless form. Its massive shadow loomed over him, a constant, oppressive reminder of his utter helplessness, its guttural roars and earth-shaking movements, a final, profound, psychological torment. The threat of being crushed a breath away, a cruel game of cat and mouse played with a dying man. Some accounts even suggest his hands were bound, making him unable to swat away the maddening insects, or even shift his position to find a sliver of shade, to avoid the relentless sun's assault on his exposed, ruined eyes. In this unimaginable state of torment, his body ravaged beyond recognition, his spirit tested to its absolute breaking limits, Marcus Atilius Regulus finally succumbed. He succumbed to his myriad wounds, to the ravages of infection, to the gnawing agony of starvation and thirst, to the soul-crushing exhaustion that finally claimed his consciousness, and to the sheer, overwhelming, systematic cruelty of his Carthaginian captors. His death was not a release, but the final brutal act in a prolonged, theatrical display of vengeance, designed not just to end a life, but to instill terror, to crush the very essence of Roman pride, and to send an unambiguous message of Carthaginian ruthlessness across the Mediterranean. Yet, in the annals of Roman history, this gruesome end did not break him. It solidified him as an eternal martyr, an embodiment of the unyielding virtue that elevated the Republic above all others, a tragic hero whose horrifying demise ironically etched his fides into eternity, transforming a defeated general into a legend that would inspire Romans for centuries to come, a chilling testament to the power of an unbreakable oath and the depths of ancient vengeance. The horrific saga of Marcus Atilius Regulus did not end with his final agonizing breath in the unforgiving embrace of Carthaginian torment. Instead, his death ignited a wildfire in the Roman consciousness, transforming a captured general into an immortal symbol, a searing testament to the Republic's unwavering ideals and the monstrous depravity of its greatest foe. News of his unspeakable suffering, meticulously detailed and undoubtedly embellished by impassioned chroniclers, swept through Rome like a tempest, curdling grief into a profound, incandescent rage. Regulus, the man who had faced unimaginable cruelty for the sake of his oath, became not merely a casualty of war, but a martyr, a sacred figure whose sacrifice elevated the very concept of Roman fides to an almost divine status. The immediate reaction was a visceral outcry, a collective gasp of horror that quickly calcified into a hardened resolve. The Roman people, already accustomed to the brutal calculus of ancient warfare, were nevertheless shocked by the sheer barbarity of Carthage's vengeance. This was not the honorable execution of a captured commander, but a prolonged, sadistic spectacle designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical torment, an act that, in the Roman worldview, placed Carthage beyond the pale of civilized nations. Regulus's name became a rallying cry, a potent symbol in the propaganda war that accompanied the clash of empires. His suffering served to justify Rome's unyielding stance, to demonize their Punic adversaries, and to reinforce the conviction that this was a war not just for territory or trade, but for the very soul of civilization itself. The stories of his blinding, his spiked prison, and his rolling torment were recounted to generations of Roman schoolchildren, not as cautionary tales of defeat, but as inspiring narratives of unwavering courage and self-sacrificing patriotism. Yet, woven into this tapestry of grief and glorification lies a darker thread: the specter of retribution. Roman accounts, notably those of Diodorus Siculus and Appian, suggest that the Carthaginian cruelty did not go unpunished. Upon learning of Regulus's barbaric fate, the Roman Senate, it is said, unleashed a savage reprisal upon the high-born Carthaginian captives held within Roman dungeons. The wife of Regulus, the long-suffering Marcia, is specifically named as the orchestrator of a horrifying retaliation. Two prominent Carthaginian noblemen, Boethus and Hamilcar, were allegedly imprisoned in a spiked chest, mirroring Regulus's own torment, and subjected to a slow, agonizing death by torture and starvation. This grim symmetry of suffering, a direct echo of the cruelty inflicted upon their hero, speaks to the profound depth of Roman outrage and their unyielding belief in lex talionis, the law of retaliation. While some modern historians view this narrative of Roman retribution with a degree of skepticism, seeing it as a moral justification for Roman brutality rather than a purely factual account, its very existence in the historical record underscores the emotional impact of Regulus's story and the lengths to which Romans were willing to go to balance the scales of justice, even if it meant stooping to the level of their barbaric enemies. It is here, in the telling and retelling, that the line between verifiable fact and embellishing legend begins to blur. The core narrative of Regulus's capture, his oath, his return to Rome, and his counsel against peace and prisoner exchange is widely accepted by historians as historically sound. It aligns perfectly with the Roman emphasis on virtus, manly virtue, and pietas, dutiful reverence for gods, family, and state, and the inviolability of an oath. However, the exquisitely gruesome details of his execution, particularly the spiked barrel and the prolonged nature of the torture, have been subject to scholarly debate. Ancient Roman historians, eager to lionize their heroes and demonize their foes, were not averse to exaggerating details to serve a didactic or patriotic purpose. Carthaginian sources, which might have offered a counter-narrative, are tragically scarce, having largely been destroyed by the very Roman conquest they sought to resist. It is plausible that while Regulus certainly suffered a cruel and protracted death at the hands of the Carthaginians, the specific, almost theatrical elements of his torture as described by later Roman authors may have been enhanced over time to maximize his martyrdom and underscore Carthaginian villainy. The narrative of his blinding and the spiked chest appears most prominently in later accounts, suggesting a possible cumulative elaboration. Nevertheless, regardless of the precise degree of factual accuracy in every gruesome detail, the legend of Marcus Atilius Regulus calcified into an unshakable cornerstone of Roman moral education. He became the quintessential embodiment of Roman character, stoic, honorable, self-sacrificing, prioritizing the state above self, and upholding his word above all else. His story was invoked by Cicero, Horace, Livy, and other towering figures of Roman literature and philosophy, always as an exemplar of the highest virtues. For Horace, Regulus's return to Carthage was an act of sublime heroism, a man deliberately choosing a gruesome death to preserve the moral integrity of Rome. Cicero cited him as the ultimate example of officium, duty, arguing that his actions demonstrated that true honor resided in principle, even when that principle led to personal annihilation. The legacy of Regulus transcended the political and military. It became a deep cultural current, shaping the Roman understanding of heroism and sacrifice. His image, whether entirely factual or partly legendary, served as a powerful reminder of the values that were believed to have forged Rome into a dominant power. He was a constant moral compass, pointing toward an ideal of selfless devotion that future generations of Romans were expected to emulate. Even today, though shrouded in the mists of antiquity and debated by scholars, the name of Marcus Atilius Regulus evokes a powerful image, that of a man who, when confronted with the ultimate choice between life and honor, unhesitatingly chose the latter, etching his name into the very bedrock of Western civilization, a grim yet enduring testament to the terrible power of an oath. If you were Marcus Atilius Regulus, facing such an impossible dilemma, what choice would you have made? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories from ancient history.